Well, here we are, folks. Welcome. Another Tuesday evening, another live stream, and great to see you on this evening. Thank you very much for taking some time out. We're in pre-show mode just for a few seconds as we count down to 8 p.m. Sydney time, and should be an interesting conversation tonight, of course, specifically around property investing. Just before I get into that, here are the dogs, relaxed after their walk this morning. Yes, it was actually quite a nice morning. We had a very, 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 very stormy weekend with Storm Bert. And in fact, a great lump of tree came through my roof. So I've had a bit of an issue there with water coming in. Got people coming later on this morning. It's possible this stream might be a bit shorter than normal because of that. So we'll see how it goes. Trying to get it sorted out. Not sure how serious it is, but the net result is we had a shower where we didn't want to have a shower. No, oh dear. It was very, very, very windy. Just for those who may not know, this is the studio setup here. We've got everything running tonight. We've got the chat. We've got the multi-view. We've got the various other screens there that controls the show. And I think we're all set to go because we've now hit 8 p.m. So let's come back to the main screen. And then I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 26th of November 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show this evening. Thank you for taking some time out to spend it with me. Really appreciate it, and hope you're all well. The weather in Australia is certainly quite weird at the moment. Quite warm, of course, in some areas, and we had a big storm here, Storm Bert. Funny name for a storm, but it really came thundering through, a lot of rain, a lot of wind, and it's unfortunately created some local damage here. So trying to get it sorted out now. Anyway, hopefully we'll be able to put a bit of time into this show. There's no guest today, it's just me, but I wanted to talk specifically about some of those issues relating specifically to the wonderful question of property investing. Is it a nightmare or is it a great deal? It's actually a very important question, of course, in the current environment, as we'll see as we look at the data, because actually maybe both is true. Before I get into that, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific financial or property or legal advice. It's the general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions in. If you've got a specific question you'd like me to answer, if you use that Walk the World, that'll get to my queue and my attention. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to make a contribution to what we do around here, or indeed get your question to the top of the list, you can use Super Chat to do that. Really greatly appreciate all the support we get. Helps to cover some of the costs of doing this. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had. So, property investing. Question is it a nightmare or is it a great deal? And interestingly, I've had a number of conversations through my one-on-one series. That's where I've had an individual conversation with a particular household about their particular situation. And quite a few of them have been relating to property investment in recent times. So I thought I'd try and distill some of the observations from that and try and figure out which is true. And as we'll see, I think both could potentially be true depending on where you are from a geographic perspective, what type of property you're looking at, and also what your own financial position is. Now, just as a way into that, let's just share a few data points. This is actually showing the new loan commitments. And you can see here that the ABS showed that there was quite a rise both in owner-occupied, but also in investor lending. And in fact, in recent times, investor lending has been quite strong. Another way of looking at it is on a monthly basis. This is excluding refinancing. This shows you that the investor story was extremely strong. It's maybe easing back just a little bit, but nevertheless, wherever you look, you can see that across the country, some of the states, particularly New South Wales and Queensland, is very, very strong. Victoria, not so much. And that really takes us to the first observation. Here is a post that came in quite recently from viewcom.au that said where property investors are flocking to and where they're pulling out. And this is effectively, of course, highlighting the interesting analysis that CoreLogic did, showing that in some places, despite strong credit growth, some areas of the country are much less attractive. Nationally, the rise in investor activity is quite geographically specific. And in fact, CoreLogic talks specifically about fly-in and fly-out areas where you get a high concentration of investment purchases, like Mackay, for example, up around there, and a few other areas as well over in WA. But if you look at it, then activities have been in New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia, whereas investment has been much less profound, and in fact going the direction in Victoria. So what's going on? Well, I think the first thing to underscore is that there is a lot of mythology around property investing. Of course, the fact of the matter is that there are significant tax breaks available for property investors. They can offset some of their losses against other income. And so there is actually a tax argument for property investing. There's also a big argument to suggest that the negative gearing support and the other bits and pieces and the tax breaks for property investors are actually stoking house prices. Of course, the Greens walked away from trying to get some of those things changed recently, and the government passed the couple of bills over the last 24 hours relating specifically to buy to let and also relating to the joint owned properties. But nevertheless, when you come to think about property investing, obviously everybody talks about gross and investment yields. It's worth just thinking about that in a bit more detail because, of course, gross investment yields are just the ratio of the purchase price of the property compared to a theoretical full-year rental yield expressed as a percentage. So in other words, how much can I get on a yearly basis, assuming that the property is fully rented out? That gives me a cash amount. And then what is the purchase price if I were to buy that property? And you express it as a percentage. Now, one of the problems with the gross investment yield is it doesn't necessarily include all of the costs of acquiring the property, for example, such as stamp duty and other costs. And the rental yield, of course, is based on a full year occupation assumption, and some properties are not necessarily occupied the full year. Now, the net investment yield is the ratio of actual income generated from rental property compared to the costs of holding and maintaining the property. And that can include things like interest payments, maintenance costs, strata fees, management fees. There's a whole long list of things that you could actually add to that list. And interestingly, when I talk to people about this, there's a lot of fixation on the gross investment yield. That's the one, of course, that all the property portals go on about and quote left, right, and center. But actually, the gross investment yield doesn't necessarily give you a very good feel for what it's really like on the ground owning investment property. And in fact, it's the net investment yield which effectively tells you a lot about the cash flows. Now, of course, if you assume that capital appreciation is going to be really, really strong, then you might say, well, I'm prepared to lose money on a cash flow basis and write off what I can against tax because I'm going to get capital appreciation. But the question, of course, is capital appreciation assured? Well, maybe not in all of the country at the moment. And as we'll see shortly, there are some reports now coming out suggesting that property prices are easing and could well ease ahead. So if you strip away the prospect of capital appreciation, then the cash flow story, the net investment yield story, becomes really more important. Now, it's interesting to say that in my conversations with people, when they talk about their investment portfolio, they're pretty clear about the gross investment yield, but often have never sat down to calculate their net investment yield. And so that's one of the exercises that I sometimes do with people. And it's quite hard sometimes to sort of strip out all of the elements because you got to, for example, think about maintenance costs. Now, some property investors don't maintain their properties, and you can do that for a period of time. But ultimately, what happens is that the quality of the property degrades. And so you need to calculate in your assessment of the net investment yield, I think, some costs of maintenance. And what about the idea of managing the property yourself versus having a property manager? If you have a property manager, you pay them fees. Those fees are paid whether or not rental income is coming in. And of course, in some areas, you can find a tenant relatively easily. In other areas, you might have a tenant, but actually not a very good tenant. And so they actually end up costing you money because of the repairs that you need to do. The bond might not cover it, etc. Or you might, in the other situation, have a great rental from a well-known tenant, but that may not be market relevant. And you don't really want to put the rent up, because if you do, then you might upset that tenant, or you might lose that tenant and you might get somebody else. And there are horrendous stories of some tenants not looking after the property and not paying the rent. Others prefer to have a lower rental stream, but certainty. So, there's a lot of questions in this. Now, when you actually come to think about this in a bit more detail, it's worth just sort of saying, well, what do we think the outlook's going to be for property? Now, I've shared my scenarios. I might touch on that shortly. But it was interesting that Louis Christopher actually published his latest boom and bust report. This is, of course, from SQM Research. And he's suggesting that housing prices could fall by 5% in 2025 in Sydney and Melbourne, driven by a glut of listings, unaffordable prices, and high interest rates. And prices in Canberra and Hobart are also predicted to drop by up to 6% and 3% respectively. But there are then upsides in some others. For example, Adelaide and Perth and Darwin are seeing some gains. So you can see there, and he actually has some different scenarios, so you can go and check that out in more detail if you want to, that, there are some variations. And what I quite like about Louis is that he does have some interesting, quite important scenarios. And interestingly, even his more positive scenarios, Adelaide might be doing quite well, Perth might be doing very well, and Brisbane pretty well. But if you look at some of the others, not so much. And this is an important point because, of course, if you are thinking about property investment, one of the questions is, what is your view of the capital appreciation that might be likely? And remember, of course, that there is still a tax liability on capital appreciation if you decide to sell. But, of course, it's much more tax effective relative to some other types of investments. So that's one reason why capital appreciation is valued quite highly. Now, when I do my scenarios, and Louis does it, and I do them, we don't do this because we think we're predicting the futures. It's more about sensitivity. It's more about trying to actually understand what might be going on. And look, we've seen these before. There's my scenario. The best is the Goldilocks zone, where you've got rates hanging around, fall later, migration remains strong. That gives us some upside. The base case is a soft landing, where we've got rates at 4.35%. Inflation falls but then rises again and stays a target till 26. That's pretty much what the RBA is saying. No recession in Australia, but migration eases back. And then, of course, the nightmare scenarios, we see stronger rate rises. We have a unemployment rise. We have a recession. Migration drops. Rates are cut later, but it's all a bit late. Now, if you take that and then say, well, what does that mean? WA, this is actually now for my November, so this is the latest analysis that I've done, shows that best case, very strong growth for houses. The base case, maybe a slight easing, but not dramatic. And the worst case, a very significant fall. But, the worst case is probably relatively unlikely. So that's WA, and units following on quite closely in a similar sort of vein, not quite as significant fall. On the other hand, if you look at, for example, Victoria, even in the best case, it's hard to see any capital appreciation over the next 3 years. Louis and I both agree on that. The base case is potentially a more significant fall, and this is cumulatively over 3 years, so we're looking at maybe 18%. And the worst case is a fall closer to 30 or more % over 3 years. Now, I could go through the other states. I'm not going to do that because I'll do that in more detail a bit later on. Hey, Edwin, nice to see you. And as Edwin says, what about the Tom Panis index? You've got to take account of that as well. Tom, of course, has been talking about falls and what have you in Sydney. Now, my view is that those are a little bit overdone, but then he swings like a yo-yo. So who knows what Tom really thinks about anything. Maybe it's about getting the next deal. But what's interesting about all of this is when you start drilling into this in a bit more detail, you start finding some quite interesting data points. And I thought what I might do is to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm seeing in my data. And I'm going to look first at a bit of gross investment yield mapping. But then I want to show you another way of looking at the data, which perhaps is a little bit more powerful as well. So let's just cut to the gross investment yields. And let me do that there. That should go there. That should go there. Yep, there we go. Right, so this is actually the gross investment yield map for Sydney. And just to be clear, this is based on the surveys that I run and the calculations that I run off the back of those surveys. And you can see there that the gross investment yield is looking in the sort of the 4-3 range, closer into Sydney. Now, if you pull out a little bit, you can see there that we get some variations. The yields are a little bit lower if you look around the Bondi area, or if you go to the inner west. Remember, this is the comparison between the income that you get from the property and the price. Parramatta is a little bit down, Fairfield is a little bit down, Liverpool's a little bit down. But, you know, there isn't anything hugely dramatic here. There's a few areas where, you know, 2.555, where you're looking at below 2.5%. But from a gross investment yield, well, maybe not too bad. Remember that this is gross, though, so you've got to take account of any tax liabilities you may have. 2.765, and up around the hills is a bit lower as well. And so it goes on. So you can see there that there's quite a significant story, but nothing dramatic. Now, if I were to then look at another one, let's go to Victoria. And once again, the gross investment yields don't look so bad. You know, they're in the yellow range, nothing dramatic, but nothing particularly worrisome. And the point I want to make is that these gross investment yields don't really tell you very much at all. There's a few areas where yields are a bit lower, somewhere they're a bit higher, but really doesn't tell you too much at all. And if we were to go to Brisbane. Now in Brisbane, yields are a little bit higher. So you can see here closer into South Brisbane, Brisbane City, Fortitude Valley, they're up around the 4.6 to 5.1. Pull out a little bit further and you can see there that they're in the sort of the 3s to the 4s. And as you pull out, you know, there's a few areas where they're stronger, a few areas where they're weaker, but really, you know, it doesn't look too bad and nothing much to see here really. And you could go on like that. And we just look at one more. Let's go over to Perth and just look at Perth as well. Now in Perth, again, yields are not bad. If you look closer in at 6004 in East Perth or Leederville 6007, you can see there that they are actually not too bad. You know, some other areas not quite so strong, but as you pull out, South Perth is pretty good. Mount Clermont and Swanbourne, a bit lower further out. But again, the gross investment yields don't really tell you that much at all. So let's now look at the net investment yields. Remember that the net investment yields are in fact defined as the ratio of real income to effectively the costs on a cash flow basis. And here you can see that we've got a very different set of scales, particularly because we've got a lot where the investment yields are quite strongly negative. So the reds now are below 4.4% and the blues are above 0.05% and higher. So Paddington's not doing too badly if I look at New South Wales. But if you look at the inner west, if you look at North Sydney, if you look at some of the areas around Bondi Junction and Randwick, you've got quite a lot of red. So there are areas in the Greater Sydney region where today people are not making any cash flow appreciation on their properties. Now, of course, they're going to argue that the values are rising, but as I showed you, both my scenarios and Louis' scenarios suggest that prices might not be rising for the next year or two. So the question is, what does that tell you about property investing in the Greater Sydney area? From a net cash flow perspective, there are areas where they are doing not that well. Now, if I go to Melbourne, you can see once again, in and around the centre of town, there are a few areas not doing too badly. So 3008, for example, in some of the Docklands area, not too bad. That's because the rentals are quite strong there. But if you look further out and in the inner rim around Melbourne, you can see there that there's a lot of red. And some of that red's quite stark. So we're above 4% negative in the cash flow terms. And as we pull out, there's a fairly consistent pattern. This is one of the reasons why property investors are quitting in the greater Melbourne area. It's simply because on a cash flow basis, and now with no capital appreciation, property investing ain't particularly fun. Now, if I go to Brisbane and do the same thing there, you can see that the story is rather different. So there, the net cash flow is quite a lot stronger. And whilst there's still cost involved in managing investment property and there are still some dogs, there's quite a few stars too. So you can see there we're in good positive territory in some areas. And remember that the scale is 0.05 and above, and in some cases it's quite strongly above. And when I've looked at individual postcodes, as I did a couple of weeks ago, you could see there that there were specific areas where the returns were pretty strong. So the comparison between, let's say, Brisbane and Melbourne is remarkable. And I'll make the point that even in some of those areas around the Ipswich area where we know that there's a lot of stress, particularly rental stress, the returns aren't flash, but they're not doing as badly as Melbourne. And we might just look at Adelaide to give us another stake in the ground, because Adelaide is actually performing relatively well from a net investment yield perspective. But once again, it's not uniform. So if you look at Fulham Gardens, for example, or West Beach, or Everett Park, or Greenacre, you can see there that there are areas where there is a net investment yield that's negative. So that's one way of looking at the data. Now, there's another way, which I think actually is quite powerful too. And I'd like to share that picture now with you. And to do that, I just need to load a couple of other screens. There we go. So here's another way of looking at the same information. Now, this is for the whole of Australia. And what I've done here is I've shown for all postcodes the gross investment yield, and you can see it varies, 4% plus, minus, some up towards 6%, some down towards 3%. But you can see that it's pretty consistent across the country, with a slight rise towards those with the net investment yield being higher. But this is the really important one. This net investment yield plot shows you that across the country, roughly, give or take, roughly half of properties are underwater, maybe slightly more actually, if you look at it where it actually crosses. In my calculation, it's about 1/3, 2/3. So let's say 2/3 of investment properties are underwater from a cash flow perspective. Now, we can, of course, be more specific. So if I then drill down and look at, for example, Victoria. So this is the same plot, but just for Victoria. And what you can see here is that there is a slight drift up from the gross investment yield for those properties with a better net investment yield. But you can see here that, well, it's more than 3/4 of property in the Melbourne area, this is Victoria, of course, including Melbourne, is underwater. And some of them are quite dramatically underwater. So we're seeing 5, 6, 7% down towards 2%, a lot below the waterline and some above. And, the best is around 2%, but there aren't that many. So 3293, postcode where there's some returns there. Now, if we were to compare that with, for example, let's go to Queensland. Remember I said that Queensland was doing remarkably well, and you can see the difference here. So here is the difference. So you can see the crossover point here is about 1/3. So 1/3 of properties in Queensland are underwater from a cash flow perspective. Looking at the gross investment returns, they're pretty consistent, whether you've got negative or positive net investment yields. And the strongest yields above 3% in net investment terms. There are some minus 4%. So you can see here the scale. And 4420 and 4364 are postcodes over here where there's a lot of goodness going on from a net investment yield perspective. But over here, you've got some like 4705 and 4743 where things are not as good. If I then go to another state why don't we try, let's go to Tasmania. So Tasmania, of course, has been quite interesting. Tasmania's not doing too badly. Remember that, of course, statistically speaking, this is a smaller sample, but you can see there that about a quarter of properties in Tasmania are actually losing money, -4. Some of them are doing quite well, up to +4. And you can see here that the net investment yields are moving up, but the gross investment yields are relatively static from one end of the spectrum to another. And we can go and look at the others. Let's look at ACT. Of course, ACT has rental controls. So what happens there? Well, actually, you can see there that the returns are, from a gross perspective, between 4 and 5%, but the net investment yields, roughly just over a third, are underwater. But look at this. The net investment yields are much weaker, and that's because of the rental controls. So what we see is 1% relative to 3% or 4% that we saw in some other places. And you can see here that there are some properties underwater by 2%. And let's just complete the picture. South Australia, perhaps we'll do. Here we go. Oops, sorry, I've mixed up. I've got New South Wales in there too. Let's get rid of that. There you go. South Australia. South Australia doing all right. So we're slightly above the third. But what's interesting there is that the best returns are gross positive, about 4%. Net investment yield above 2%, but not that many. 5.734 is the best. And going down to the other end, 5.244, under 4% is the worst. And did I do New South Wales? I can't remember. We'll do it again just in case, because I wanted just to re-emphasize a couple of issues with New South Wales. So we'll put in New South Wales. There you go. So this is the New South Wales story. And this is quite surprising, but not necessarily surprising. And what's happening here is that because of the pressure on rental rises, 2%, not doing too well. But look, we've got a really lot of property across New South Wales where net investment yields are actually quite significantly negative, up to 1% negative, and then a few tailing right off down towards 4%. So 2.738, 2.354 down at the bottom end, and 2.783 and 2.588 at the top end. So I think this is really interesting because it shows you that there are significant variations in different parts of the country. And so that's why we are seeing significant variations between different types of property investors. So in Victoria, the story is ultimately of property investors looking to leave. So we're seeing a lot of listed property in Victoria at the moment, as I discussed with Edwin yesterday. And a lot of that is ex-investment property. A lot of it's poorly maintained. And of course, we've also got the Victorian government intervention in terms of requiring high levels of standards, in terms of more and all those things, maintenance and those things. So that means that the fact of the matter is that there's a lot going on in Victoria at the moment. Now, if you look at Victoria, you get one end of the spectrum. If you go up to Queensland, it's a little stronger, although, of course, there are now some nascent controls in Queensland coming in. In New South Wales, those controls are in. So there's a lot going on there. Now, Edwin makes an interesting point, which I'll just put this up if I may. Need to explore more the notion that a number of investors don't have high loan-to-value ratios or losses on their properties. 3 of our clients are buying investment properties without bank assistance. Now, that's a really, really important point, because one of the things that I'm seeing as well is that we have people buying with cash, buying investment properties with cash. Why? Because they are looking at the very long term rather than the short term. Because one of the reasons why the investment returns are negative, of course, is that many people did leverage up. When interest rates were ultra low, people were leveraging up with really, really big mortgages. And then the mortgage rate went up, and that put huge impost on their cash flows. But if you don't actually have a mortgage, then you've got a much more sort of smooth platform to make returns over time and hold on in times of property depreciation. Because, let's face it, ultimately property prices will continue to go to the right if you take a 5 or 10 or 15-year view. So for those people who are looking at the opportunity to buy because prices have come off their highs, Some of the property investments are, quite a lot cheaper than they used to be. So maybe it makes sense. And in some markets, it does. I think in New South Wales, it might make sense. But you've got to buy the right property. If you are buying investment property with units rather than houses, then the other big factor, the sleeping factor, has been the very significant rise in strata fees. And we're seeing those rises continuing. That's because of the poor maintenance of the properties and the poor construction quality and all those things too. So it's really important to tease out units versus houses. And, do you need to borrow? Do you not need to borrow? And what are your expectations short-term and long-term? And that's why we've got this massive divergence between investors. Some property investors saying, well, I can get 5% sitting in a term deposit at the moment without any hassle of poor tenants, without any maintenance issues, et cetera, et cetera. And sure, I have to pay some tax on that, but it's still worth it, because from a gross and net investment yield, it's a different proposition. Other people are saying, no. I still believe that property is a long-term hold, and so this is a good time to get in and buy. And the truth is that both can be true. Edmund's really on form tonight. Edwin, a very important point you've just thrown up there. Don't forget, post-purchase outside traditional management, we have budget accommodation, as the WeChat chatterers and the silent tigers highlight. And that's silent tigers highlight. That's the other point. So there are people who are actually looking at investment property through a very different lens. So it's not just one tenant, but they subdivide the property. They put more rooms in and they let out individual rooms. And, you can see that the returns are dramatically higher than your typical return from a rent. As A23 says, so it's like 10 people in a house. Exactly right. So basically you let out each room. Each room is then, bringing in quite a lot of income. Now, whether that's in line with planning, is it even disclosed? The planners is an interesting question, but we're seeing quite a lot of that. So again, that would highlight that this is going to be much more in the area of houses rather than units. And so I do believe that there is a significant set of pressures, particularly in the unit pace. And we're actually seeing unit prices, of course, continuing to fall in and around Sydney. As A23 says, are you allowed to do that? Probably not, but that doesn't stop them. And, we in our conversations with Edwin and our rants, we sometimes talk about people subdividing individual rooms and then, putting in a very small bathroom or, a toilet and a hand basin in that room and say, see, it's self-contained. Probably not legal, probably breaking all sorts of fire regulations. As down under Drover says, Indians in Melbourne North and West Burbs already have 10 to 12 people in a 3-bedroom house. Will Book says it is illegal to sublet if not own property of the house. And it's like shifts leading in a unit, says Jason. Well, that's all things going on. And, a lot of this into people don't understand what's going on here. And in fact, as Edwin said, Dusty can turn a 2-bedroom apartment in Ashfield into a 4-bedroom room now. And that's exactly the point, right? 4 rooms, 4 rental stream incomes. So your average net investment yield is very different. So given the fact that we've talked about the trends with regard to, as Drew says, time to buy a 3-bedroom house and put 6 capsules in each room, like a capsule house hotel. Jason says, what about the pods? Yep. I mean, all those things are happening. So the truth of the matter is that there's a lot going on below the waterline. Now, if you are a standard property investor and you're not sort of thinking that you're competing with people who are actually able to do what we're talking about here and subdivide, you will be paying a lot more because they have a capacity to pay more because their strategy for getting a return on it is very different to yours. And this is one of the things that we've seen quite often with regards to the way that property is occurring at the moment, that in some markets, for some types of property, you are competing on an unlevel playing field because there are other people with maybe cash in their back pocket who are looking to subdivide and looking to generate this significant rental income, and even if they break some rules along the way. And honestly, there's not a clampdown on it. It's happening in many parts of the country, but obviously in the major suburban areas of Melbourne and Sydney particularly, and I think also up in Brisbane as well. So those are some of the factors to bear in mind. So this is a really interesting and important set of conversations that we're having here, because what it tells you is that the story of investment property is much, much more complex than the general discussion that we see. And I always come back to the fact that, in the real world, things are quite different from what is being spoken about. And, here's a sort of a interesting little observation, because we've had distressed sales are rising, says the RBA. A number of homes being put up for sale because owners are financially distressed is rising. Borrowers are experiencing persistent difficulties servicing their mortgages. No further options, said Chris Kent. And you can see some distressed listings. Mind you, the rates buffers were held amid the loan stress. That's according to APRA. Now there's an inquiry going on at the moment. Maybe that'll change. But the fact of the matter is that, there are a lot of people doing it tough, finding it difficult. And a standard property investor who simply got one tenant with a mortgage, when you do the math, is significantly underwater in many parts of the country. Now, if you can hold on, that's fine. If you can't, you've got to do something. Other point to make, if you look at it from a segmented perspective, as I've shown in previous shows, a lot of the investment property are held by more affluent households. So we're seeing quite a few people, young affluents and also the most affluent people, holding 4, 6, 10, 20 investment properties. Now, within that portfolio, they may well have some that are not doing that well, others that are doing somewhat better. So what we're seeing at the moment is those people are shedding some of their less good performing properties, and also they're bolstering their position with regards to the ones that are actually doing better. Maybe they've got better capital appreciation, maybe they've got better rental streams. So you have to do the maths, you have to do the calculations, and you have to actually really understand to make a good judgment. Now, one of the questions I also get quite often is, well, I'm a first-time buyer, I can't afford to buy into, say, Sydney or Melbourne at the moment, but I want to get into the property market, so should I buy an investment property? And that's quite tricky, of course, because you probably can borrow. The banks have been quite willing to lend for property investment at the moment, as I showed at the start of the show. The question is, you've got to be careful what you buy. If you buy a unit, and specifically a relatively recently constructed unit, or worse still off the plan, chances are you won't make a huge return on that. In fact, capital appreciation is being destroyed in and around the suburban areas of Sydney at the moment. North Ryde is a great example, where you've got the 2017 prices. 1917 will be a bit different. 2017 prices compared with 2024 prices are lower now than they were then. So buying an investment unit in an outer suburban area may not be very sensible. Buying a house might be more sensible, but then generally the gross investment yields tend to be slightly higher for units rather than houses. So that sort of steers you into units. So you get really conflicting stories. And what I say to people who are thinking about doing this is do the math. Work out what the likely cash flow is going to be. Then you can make a decision. Also form a view, of course, as to whether you think property prices are going to rise or fall. And that's going to be based on your estimate of where you think the RBA is going to set rates and what's going to happen to the broader economy and all those things, what Trump is going to do. I mean, who knows? That's why I run scenarios rather than make predictions. So it is quite complicated. I do, though, want to underscore this point. I've had more than a handful of conversations with first-time buyers who bought an investment property in the last 18 months to then regret it for two reasons. Firstly, the interest rate stayed high, and so the mortgage was actually taking a bigger share of the income than they expected. And secondly, the rental that they expected to get, they didn't get, and the costs of managing the property and dealing with the maintenance issues were higher than expected. So it's very interesting that a lot of people made bad decisions. I'm really concerned that a lot of these first-time buyers are being lured in, and as a result of that, there are significant questions ahead. Edwin makes an interesting point. I can bet you dust is next week's wet food that most people with more than 2 investment properties have liar loans in one form or another. Just putting it out there. Well, we do see that. And remember, when I look at a household, Edwin, I'm looking at all of their properties and all of their loans. Often the banks are only looking at part of the picture. And even with the credit scores, they don't necessarily have a full picture to evaluate what's really going on. So my view is that quite a few of those more affluent households who have these portfolios have actually done a few things under the hood to try and actually get their mortgages, and their cash flows are under pressure. And as a result of that, we are seeing quite a lot of stress. And rental stress, of course, as I showed in my show a couple of weeks ago, at 76% of all households is extremely high. Now, it's very high specifically among first-generation migrants who've come into Australia because they've got no choice, but it's also quite high amongst affluent households and young affluent households who have a high proportion of the investment properties. Jason makes a very important point too. Chances are, if you buy off the plan of something built recently, probably many defects due to the bodgy builders that entered the market recently and cost cut and used dodgy trade is absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why we are seeing strata fees rising dramatically, why we're seeing quite a few people stuck now with an investment property they can't sell because there's too many defects and they can't necessarily get those defects fixed. And of course, it means higher strata fees for longer. And in some cases, of course, it's worth remembering that we saw some high-rise buildings where people were forced to come out. The Mascot Tower's one a good example. And there were property investors and even some owners who actually had to leave. And in some cases, the value of that property now is close to zero, or in some cases, they settled for a much lower capital payment to get out than they expected to get. So it shows you that this is a very complex situation. So the story, of course, as to what happens next is going to be determined by all these broader economic issues that we've been talking about in recent times. Will rates come down? Well, they probably will eventually, but probably not necessarily that soon. The fact of the matter is that we've got significant pressure, of course. We do have this listings question at the moment. Listings soar in Sydney and Melbourne as homeowners run down their savings. Homeowners pressurised by stubbornly high interest rates are unable to service mortgages and are bringing properties to the market in even greater numbers in Sydney and Melbourne. And that's one of the reasons why people are actually suggesting there's going to be issues. Of course, in the Gold Coast, we've got significant issues there with Gold Coast apartment development. Some of the new ones are not being built. Some of the old ones were of poor quality. And there's a lot of costs involved. I was talking to someone the other day, one of the ones who's got an investment portfolio in Gold Coast apartments. And we went through the numbers, and he'd never done it before. He was horrified at what he was losing. So it just shows you that once you decide that there's a problem, and you start pulling the lid off, then you see that under the hood there's some real issues. And of course, we highlighted this the other day. Borrowers desperate for rates to fall, but it's unlikely that we're going to see rate cuts anytime soon. The latest estimates of when rates are going to be cut are being kicked out to the second half of next year now. And if Trump does what he said with tariffs, and he made some announcements overnight, and he started to impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada, that could translate to higher interest rates in other places too, including Australia. And therefore, it's quite likely that we are going to see more people in difficulty. Now, of course, there are people spruiking. There are people suggesting that the Sydney house prices are on track to keep falling. When to the middle of next year, home values will push drift lower in Melbourne, Hobart and Canberra. Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane could entirely escape the downswing. So it does depend on where you look. And that's another point. It's not necessarily all the same. It's a matter of how it all plays out. Now, a very interesting point, A23 said unemployment is the key. I think you're right, insofar that if the unemployment rate stays relatively low, knocking around 4%, people will still have income coming in and they'll be able to sort of get by. If unemployment starts to rise more significantly, then two things could happen. One is the rate cuts could come sooner, but also more people will get under pressure. And we saw previously, of course, there is a real question as to the story with regards to the true situation with employment. And I also make the point that people can be employed, but not necessarily generate significant income. People are working more hours, second jobs, all those things. So the unemployment rate, as reported officially, is really not necessarily a good indicator of what is truly going on. Here's an interesting question. Is there any way of knowing if banks are selling for the owner? Well, that's an interesting question. So sometimes you will see distressed sale, in the blurb, that's a marketing spin. That's marketing spin. That's not reality. The banks are not, in the current environment, actually mortgagee in possession sales that often. There's a few, and they are actually normally spruiked to high heaven. But there are a lot of sales at the moment where the property holder, whether they're investor or an occupier, has gone through the hardship scheme, has tried all sorts of different things, but is now in the situation where they've got no choice but to sell. And so in some cases, the agents do use that, for sale, etc., etc. In other cases, they don't disclose it. So it's hard to know. And by the way, sometimes I think that is used when there's no real hardship. So, remember that this is marketing. And when market is involved, truth sometimes goes out of the window. So it is a significant pressure. And as A23 says, it's significant, particularly if you're leveraged up into property. There are a lot of people who are leveraged to the gills, and the LVRs are very high. So how does it all play out? Well, interesting question. So I guess if you think ahead, what's likely to happen with regard to properties? Well, as I said earlier on, the Labour got support from the Greens to release that build, help to buy and build to rent bills, ending long stalemate. Those probably won't have a huge difference. The tax breaks for build to rent are significant, but of course those properties are going to be built by large corporates specifically to target segments who are willing to rent. They'll be charging higher rents. They'll be having extra facilities, so they're not necessarily going to be affordable rents. And there isn't really much there to force them to be affordable at the moment. And of course, on the help to buy, 40,000 over 4 years, 10,000 a year, small incremental help. But of course, what it's going to do is push prices up. We know that first-time buyer assistance, help to buy schemes, anything like that, shifts prices higher, doesn't help everybody else, and just creates more of a problem. So in a way, these policies, which were seen as sort of, watershed moments in the way it was reported in the media, are small beer at best and really, frankly, don't have much in the way of assisting. Now, Edwin makes another interesting point. The households in most stress have toys attached to their property, mostly high-end four-wheel drives. And guess what? We are seeing some of those, of course, at the moment coming up on the market. People are actually using whatever they can to get a little bit of extra cash coming in, particularly in some areas, and look at the local adverts. The other thing, of course, to say that in some of these areas, we're starting to see social pressures now beginning to rise. Crime rates are rising in some areas. I did some modelling the other day that showed that the correlation is quite strong between mortgage stress in my modelling and the higher crime rates. So there are some consequences for these bad policies coming through, and it's all sort of flowing the wrong way at the moment. Jason says, do you think Trump's tariffs will affect housing market going forward, both the current build and also future building? How will it affect the market? Yeah, I think it probably will. So three things. Firstly, of course, interest rates will stay high for longer. Trump is going to be inflationary. Trump is going to be borrowing more. That's going to keep high interest rates, particularly in the US. The Fed will not have the ability to take rates lower. The Fed determines the market rate around the world, more or less. And whilst all the RBAs and, New Zealand RBA equivalent, etc., say, oh, we'll do it for our own economy, you've got to look at what the US is doing. The second point is that the Trump tariffs will change a few things in terms of where some of those companies are going to export from, let's say, China. Will China sell more into Australia? Will they cut prices in Australia? Who knows? That might have an impact on the economy locally, but also it might actually encourage migration. Migration, of course, is the other big lever. And, as strong migration is now being maintained, interestingly, they're not going to dial back on the student numbers. That legislation was parked, despite what was said earlier on. So you'd argue, I think, that, the Trump's tariffs and everything else will swing migration perhaps towards Australia. Australia will be seen as a more attractive place. And a lot of Asian people will say, well, looks low. Australia's worth going to. And of course, the doors are open. The doors are wide open. 500,000 plus coming in at the moment, way above what we can build. That's going to put upward pressure on property. The other factor, of course, it could actually impact the cost of materials, building materials. Particularly, we export very little in the way of building materials, but we import massive amounts into Australia at the moment. And of course, some of that comes from China. If the tariffs are higher, that could actually then change the dynamic there and actually put the price of materials up. It could be that some of those costs will actually be spread into other markets. So, all of those things are in play at the moment. So that's why I think this is a very significant factor. Edwin, you're on form tonight. Love it. Edwin says, Dusty sweat with Trump and said, if we take back Mr. Rudd, we'll be spared. True story. Well, who knows? Yes, there'll be an interesting little play there. Drew says Rudd the dud. Yeah, interesting observation. So it is fascinating what's going on there. Rudd, the architect of bailout, yeah, he's certainly part of the problem. And Andre says Trump, the Messiah, will solve the world's problems in 24 hours. Yeah, well, that's of course not going to happen, is it? So we will see some changes, but not necessarily positive changes. So all of those things are in play. Yeah. Jason said, cheers. We are in crazy times. We are in crazy times at the moment. And I want people to understand that the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of stuff going on that could change a lot, but a lot of the reporting on what's happening in the property market, and specifically among the spruiking agencies and the portals and things, are not actually telling the full story about what's going on. And that's really my message from this show tonight, which is this, that if you are a property investor and you're considering getting back into property investing or getting additional properties, you have to do the work. You have to understand where to buy, what to buy, work out what the investment streams are like, and really go into it in some detail. Don't just say, oh, look, gross investment yield 5%, can never lose, because there are some losers out there, as I showed you in my earlier data. And the bottom line is simply this, that you have to do the work. On the other hand, if you are a property investor and you are really struggling now with cash flow and you look at it and say, I'm not making anything on this, I've got no capital appreciation, and I'm losing money month on month on month on month, even if I can write off some against tax, I'm still losing more money. And I say to you, yeah, and remember 5% on a term deposit, you can get that for 4 or 5 years at the moment, still at the moment. And, that's probably a different sort of risk, but it's probably less risky. So it is very, very interesting how this all plays out. And in all of this, of course, again, you have to go granular. You have to look at investments in units versus houses. You have to look at different areas. That's why my granular data is quite useful. Of course, in my other shows, I go into individual postcodes and I report the gross and net investment yield at a postcode level, so you can see what's really going on. Now, of course, that's an average across the postcode. And in fact, if you were to drill into the postcode, you'd see that even within the postcode, there were some variations. But the fact is that, you can draw some conclusions. Generally, Melbourne, forget it. Generally, Sydney is not that attractive at the moment. Generally, ACT isn't that attractive. That's partly because of the rental controls that are in place. And Tasmania not looking flash. On the other hand, Western Australia, Queensland, South Australia are the 3 markets where there is perhaps more upside. That's why we're seeing a lot of investment interest in those markets interstate. And that's the other factor I want to highlight, that a lot of people are looking interstate and buying in other parts of the country. Western Australia, South Australia, and Queensland are seen as the more favourable markets. But let me highlight again, even in those markets, not all investment properties in those markets are actually washing their face. And not all investment markets are necessarily going to see capital appreciation as strongly as we expected maybe a year or 2 ago. Came through very strong, may not continue. And as I showed you, my scenarios for Perth, are not as strong as they were. Even Louis Christopher says maybe a bit of an easing compared with what growth we saw previously. Edwin makes this point. Some of the chatterers believe Australia will become China's dumping ground with cheap second-grade materials. Well, Edwin, I would say that's already happening. The quality of testing that's done with regard to materials coming into Australia is remarkably low. I've highlighted previously, asbestos is still in some of the sheets that are coming in at the moment, and the longevity of some of the materials, for example, some of the stainless steel on taps and things, is very, very low quality and will tend to rust very quickly. So yeah, there's a lot of poor quality stuff. That's another reason why quite often what we find is that the quality of the property that you've got is quite a bit lower than superficially might look. We talked previously about the the quick renovations, the superficial bathroom redos that fall apart within 18 months to 2 years. There's a lot of that about. Interestingly, AI says I wouldn't buy interstate. Depends where you are, I suppose, and what you consider. I can tell you that there are a lot of people looking interstate at the moment. I was talking specifically to one agent the other day who said that 2/3 of his inquiries are actually from interstate. He's in Western Australia. 2/3 of his inquiries are interstate, and the bulk of those are from New South Wales and Victoria. So I thought it was quite interesting. Okay, Jason. Smash the like button. Yeah, please do. Please like this show. It's really important to get the word out there. I'm not saying don't buy property. I'm not saying don't buy an investment property. What I'm saying is go in with your eyes open, as well as doing the financial due diligence on cash flow, net investment, yield, all those sorts of things. Also, of course, do the other things like check the quality of the property, make sure that it is reasonably well constructed, get a survey done, make sure that you do the due diligence. Edwin and I talk about this all the time, and I still find loads of people who actually make major mistakes in terms of the property they bought because they don't do their due diligence. Also, check the local area, check the planning. Is it going to be rezoned? What does that mean? All of those things. And the question is, where will the end game be for this? Now, if you believe that property will always go up, then maybe you hang in. But I would argue that there are cases now to be made in some areas that prices won't necessarily go up linearly. They will go to the right in 10 years, 20 years. So if you have a long-term view, maybe it's okay. But interestingly, many of the property investors I speak with have a 1 or 2 year view. They don't take account of the costs of entering the market in the first place, so stamp duty and the transaction cost to transfer the property, and then start from that sort of clean sheet and assume capital appreciation from day one in the more linear fashion. May not happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the fact of the matter is that you can end up with a bit of a lemon, and that's why in the sort of show picture that I used, the thumbnail for this, I thought a lemon was actually quite a good thing to show here, because actually of the people that I spoke with over the last month or so on property investing, 2/3 actually had lemons. 2/3. 1/3 had something which was looking more positive. But 2/3 of property investors I spoke with realized they got a problem, recognized they got a lemon. And sometimes when you have a property lemon, you can't just carry on regardless. You need to actually cut your losses and move on. And that's a hard conversation. It is, I think, a really, really stressful time for many people. And those with property investments are, I think, under the gun as much as others. By the way, the banks are still pushing special deals. You may have seen some of the recent reductions in interest rates, including for investors. That's because the banks recognize that some property investors are good fodder for them to lend more. Remember, the banks are uninterested in lending more, and their due diligence is pretty lightweight at the moment. And there are limitations on their assessment, particularly for property investors. And I think that in some cases I've seen overlending. Remember, of course, that many property investors do leverage up to the gills because they can offset the interest on their mortgage against other tax, and so they think they're getting a good deal. But my argument is you're not necessarily getting a good deal if you put everything else into the mixture as well and understand how all of this plays out. So there you go. I have to say that, as A23 says, sadly, the world is messed up where people can take the most risk of the runs rewarded. I agree. Yeah, make sure you can service the loan is what A23 is also saying. I agree with that. Interestingly, I find that some people just don't do the math at all. And particularly, of course, if they've got a fixed loan for a period of time, they've assumed that the rate will be as low. And we've got quite a few people who had fixed rates at 2%, and we've now got them sitting on mortgage rates of 5 or 6%. And that's creating huge eye-watering problems for them. And the longer it goes on, A23 is an interesting question. Can you do a case study? I can show you the overlending CBA is offering me. Should be really in the news. Well, if you want to send me some information via the blog, I'm happy to share what I can without giving too much away. I did actually a show some time ago where I actually compared the different underwriting standards of the different banks and looked at what they said, and then actually looked at what people actually were able to get. And in a lot of places, people were able to get a lot more money than I think was safe or secure. But of course, they argued that there were extenuating services. And interestingly, about 5% of loans at the moment are being made outside normal lending parameters and standards. That's very high. That's according to APRA, which is one of the reasons why APRA doesn't want to change to the 3% buffer. 5% of loans. And interestingly, quite a few of the investors that I spoke with had loans that were effectively outside normal lending standards and criteria, because effectively they had sufficient income from other sources to be able to actually repay the bank if things went badly. And that's what the bank does, of course. They only think about, can I get repaid? Not necessarily what's right. And look, it's interestingly a state of affairs where effectively the banks are thinking about their own interests rather than their customers, despite duty of care, etc., etc. Now, Jeff, you asked this question. What happened to the MAD legislation? The MAD bill was thrown out. Basically, it didn't get enough support, and the Labour Party withdrew it over the weekend. I made a show on that a couple of days ago. Check it out. But there's another bill, which is the under 16 social media bill, which had a very brief hearing. I made a submission. I made a show yesterday about this. They made a submission. I made a submission. And it's sort of, not quite clear as to what's going on there, because some of the Conservative side, the Liberal Nationals, are actually now saying, well, I'm not sure we want to support this. Some of the Senate crossbenchers are all saying it's nuts. One of the things that came out in the very short hearing was that digital ID could be used as a form of identification for age validation purposes, which would mean that the ID would need to be used for everybody to access social media. And as Drew says, 16-year-old social media ban, which will bring in digital ID. That's the point. So it is, I think, a way of getting digital ID through the back door. Of course, digital ID, when it was pushed in, was assuredly provided without guarantee of you have to have one. You can choose to have one if you want, the government said. But now, of course, if you actually have to use digital ID to access social media, then suddenly it's mandated. And that's why a lot of people are now saying, no, we don't want. Interestingly, there were 15,000 submissions, 15,000 for this under 16 bill in 24 hours. That's remarkable. So a lot of people were really on the case here. And frankly, it's disingenuous for Labour to have a hearing for just a day or two and then essentially just walk it through because Dutton is supporting it. It's disgraceful, but not necessarily that surprising, given the fact that News Corp and some of the other big media companies were pushing this really, really hard for months and months and months. They're, of course, doing it to safeguard their commercial interests against social media platforms. It's completely to do with their own business rather than what's right for Australia and Australians. And all of the evidence pretty much came out in that very short hearing was that, in fact, ordinary people would be disadvantaged. Age 16 ban won't work. It won't solve the problem. I realize there are problems with young people and social media, but you should be empowering parents. You should be using software. There are other routes to go, not just this blanket ban. And that, I think, is a reason why this is a really important conversation. And I'll continue to push as long as I can for this not to come in. but the government seems relatively set on it. I can't understand why. Really dumb, and it will create a lot of flack and blowback downstream, I think, as well. So there you go. Jason makes the point, and I did make this in my submission, as Rennick says, there are apps to block access from kids. Perhaps they want digital ID in so that they can sneak in digital ID, rush through with no details. Exactly right. And that's the real point here, that this is actually digital ID by proxy, in my view, and that's one of the reasons why they're pushing it in. And it's part of a global agenda, of course. It's not just Australia, other places around the world talking about this and pushing it in. Doesn't make it right. And what happens after that? Well, again, as Jason says, social credit score, central bank digital currency, all of these things need to be seen holistically. And I made an argument in my submission that what we need is a digital rights bill, and we need to have clarity about how all these things are actually going to be governed to ensure that we don't, by stealth, end up with a society that's digitally controlled. And whilst the MAD bill was hugely wrong, it's not the only bad bill out there relating specifically to government control and influence on what we think and how we think it. And therefore, social media is very, very important. And I do think there are issues that we need to address with regard to helping people better, younger people particularly, to understand what they're seeing in social media, but with better controls and with things like the apps and what have you, you can actually empower parents to take, I think, a bigger role. This shouldn't be a nanny state government issue. I want to talk about alternatives. And Edwin's just brought this up. Dusty wants to introduce the Magna bill. This is make auctions great again. First home buyers get a 10K to punch on at auctions after mum and dad contribution. Sponsored by Alba & Co Real Estate Group. Thank you, Edwin. Love it. Exactly right. Yes. I have to tell you that auctions will be great again, but of course we've talked about misinformation, disinformation. Well, I would argue that misinformation, disinformation in the context of auctions is absolutely rife. Well, I'm going to call it here, I think, because I'm expecting my roofer to appear quite soon. So I think I've covered what I wanted to cover. Just to recap a couple of things before I close out. This is a really important question. Property investors, be cautious, be careful. Make sure you do your due diligence. Make sure you actually understand what you're getting into. Make sure that the cash flow looks reasonable. Make sure that you've thought this through. Don't just take account of what gross investment yields as reported in the portals are like. There's a much more important story. Rates will stay high for longer. Westpac ticks the rate cut in late May. Others are saying even later than that now. So no early rate cuts along the cards. That's very important. By the way, unlike in New Zealand, where there's an aggressive rate cut now, forecast 75 basis points, possibly. We'll see about that. Should be interesting to see. But the fact of the matter is that if you are making those investment property decisions, make sure you get yourself informed to make sure that you actually have done the work. Make sure you've built your cash flows. Make sure you're looking over more than just 2 years as well. And, I typically suggest that a 5-year scenario is probably what you want to look at. What assumptions do you have to make, therefore, to get capital returns? And what do you think is likely in terms of the property price moves over that period? Because if, in fact, property price periods are actually different, then those movements won't necessarily mean you get the value that you might. And that's a really important point, because at the end of the day, if property investors are there, they're there to make money. If property investors lose money, then what they're going to do is get out, which is what we're seeing in Melbourne now. So this is a really important conversation. If you want to have a conversation with me about a particular suburb or postcode, I have my one-to-one. It's an individual conversation. It's not financial advice, but I can look at the stress, the home price data, and the net and gross yields, etc. It's an hour by phone or Zoom, and there's a cost involved because, of course, there's a lot of work to be done to do it for you. And if you want, contact me about the blog. 3 to 5 weeks out. I'm booking at the moment. Quite busy with this at the moment, but it is nevertheless a service which I do provide. Well, with that, I want to say thank you very much for watching the show. Jason, thank you so much for your super chat. Really, really appreciate it. And as Jason says, please hit the like and share it on the way out. It is really, really important. Thank you very much, Jason, for your super chat. It's greatly appreciated. It really helps. And Will says, thank you for that. Edwin says, thanks for the info. Guys, thanks for your commentary. Good night. Cheers, Edwin. Thank you all very much. I'm going to say cheerio now. And next week, Damon will be on. Hopefully my roof will be fixed, or at least patched or whatever. I'm not sure. We'll find out later on today. Just before I go, let me just look at the dogs. The dogs are here, sound asleep. They've been asleep the whole time. Not a squeak out of them, so it looks pretty good. Next week, Damon will be on. We'll talk about the markets and specifically the impact of Trump. And that'll be an interesting conversation. So thank you very much. Take care. Have a great evening and keep safe. And I look forward to seeing you in the next show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Cheerio.